Alright, so making a fat bass patch on our Take 5. How do we do that? So you want to start with a basic program, and the way to get to that is you hit the down transpose button, hold that, and hit the -2 octave button. And that'll give you a basic program which sounds like this. So there's a couple things I always look for when I want to make a patch on any synth, really. And if you've ever seen any of my other fat bass videos, then you'll kind of know or have an idea of where we're going to head on this one. But first off, the cool thing about the Take 5 is that it does have a sub oscillator. So if we mess around with that, well, first off, let's reduce the octave here, make it a little lower. So if we're going to mess with this octave, the oscillator 1 sub oscillator is right here. So this is without the sub oscillator, and then of course this is with it. So I mean, that kind of thickens it up a little bit, but in all honesty, all it really does is gives you more bass, but I wouldn't necessarily call that thickening, if you will, whatever you want to call it, but the sub oscillator will ensure that you do have a lot of bass. And we don't necessarily need to turn it up all the way. Let's just turn it up. We can do about 3 or 4 o'clock, you know, whatever you feel is right, which is of course the point of all my videos here is, you know, I don't want to tell you what settings to use exactly. I want you to kind of decide for yourself, and most of all, just use your ears. So we got our sub oscillator. Now we want to make sure that we have both oscillators running. So I believe when you do a basic program, it's just one oscillator. So let's turn up both of our oscillators. Now you might see me moving the knob down and back up. Now the reason for that is with a synth like the Take 5 or the Prophet 6, when you have these presets, the knobs are basically disregarded. Like, in other words, when you're using a preset, wherever the knobs are, it doesn't matter until you start moving them. So that's why you want to make sure that when you start from a basic program, you want to make sure that the knobs are actually being used. And the way to do that is to just kind of fiddle it until you hear that something is actually changing. So now we have both of our oscillators at full volume, and then we want to look at our oscillator shapes over here. And then let's also make sure, well, I guess one thing at a time, but real quick, let's make sure that our pitches are the same here. Okay, so let's put them in unison for right now. And then let's set our shapes. So I guess the best way to hear your shapes is to do one oscillator at a time. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit here and turn oscillator 2 down. So that way right now we're just hearing oscillator 1 and the sub oscillator, which you can't change the shape of that. So, but let's go ahead and change the shape over here. The best part, one of the best parts about the Take 5 and the Prophet 6 and you know, other ones similar to this is that the shape isn't fixed. You can actually have the shape blend between 2 oscillators. So let's try and find a shape that is conducive for a fat bass sound. Now, I'm pretty partial to the sawtooth here and the square. I like the sound of both of those. So let's try setting oscillator 1 to square. And then let's turn oscillator 2 back up and set that to sawtooth. Okay, so I like where that's going, but we can mess around with that a little later if we want. But now, so the next step is we have both oscillators turned up, we have the sub oscillator turned up. Now we want to take these out of unison. Unison just means that the pitch is exactly the same. So in order to fatten up the sound a little bit, you want to actually detune or just change one of the pitches just a little bit lower or a little bit higher than unison. So let's mess around with that a little bit. Honestly, it doesn't really matter to me whether you go up or down. The whole point of this, though, is that you don't want to necessarily throw the pitch up or down like a half step. It's actually kind of in between a half step or a semitone, however you want to look at it. You don't want to quite go all the way to a half step. Because then it just kind of gives you the impression that it's out of tune. So the half step is probably right about there where the tick mark is. So you want to kind of detune it in between that tick mark and the 0. Now let's turn off the sub oscillator just to see what it sounds like. Now you can clearly hear that the sub oscillator definitely adds the bass that you want if you're trying to go for like a super thick sound. Now let's look at the filter a little bit. So let's start with the filter wide open. And then let's sweep it downwards and see what happens. Also, you want your resonance to be down all the way. Another thing I forgot to mention is that you want it to be in unison mode. Now what that does is that takes it out of polyphonic mode, so that way you can't do chords. You can only do one note at a time, and the reason for that is it just kind of fattens the sound up when you go to unison mode because you're just playing one note essentially. So we're pretty much there, or we can just add some overall overdrive. So let's mess around with that a little bit. Now, using the overdrive here, that essentially just determines whether you have a dirtier bass sound or just kind of a cleaner bass sound. Personally, I love the sound of the dirty, overdriven bass, but at the same time, you know, sometimes you don't always want that. So another thing, let's go back and look at, I'll turn the overdrive down a little bit, or all the way. And let's look at what happens if we set both oscillators to square. Now, personally, I don't know about you, but to me, to my ears, I like the sound of having oscillator 2 set to sawtooth. You can totally hear when you switch back. Having the sawtooth just adds like this kind of girth to the sound, in my opinion. But again, you know, that's for you to decide whether or not you like the sawtooth or the square. I mean, we could even try sine. But I think as far as fattening goes, as far as making the sound as thick as possible, I think the sawtooth with the square is a really good. Another thing we can look at, what happens when we set them both oscillators to both shapes. That's an interesting one for sure. I feel like on some level though, you kind of lose. It sounds different, it's a different tone, but you kind of lose a little bit of the girth, I feel like. But anyway, that's just kind of a little bit of a walkthrough of my thought process when I'm trying to make a new patch on the Take 5. So I hope that helps you guys. If you have any questions, of course, leave them down below. Any comments, concerns, requests for new videos. If you just got a Take 5 and you're looking to learn some stuff, definitely leave a comment below. Let me know how much you love the Take 5 like I do. I love the smaller form factor of it, and it's just an all-around amazing synth, really. So hope that helps you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.